middle parak Dalet, in the bottom of 363 or 365, these pages. So in order to explain what happens when a person does a sin, and therefore what happens when a person does Teshuvah, we need to get to the first and most important thing is to understand what the nature of the neshama is, what the nature of the Jewish soul is, and how it's such a central component to all of existence, to Hashem's plan, to who we are and what we are, etc. And then understanding the essence of who we are and our connection to Hashem and how that plays into the Hashem's cosmic plan, then we understand the consequences of our sin and therefore are more driven to do teshuvah be'emes of lev shalom, truthfully and wholeheartedly. So after the period, the fourth to bottom line. We'll understand the matter, all of the above questions, and understanding what teshuvah is all about. So based on that which the verse reads, Kechelek Hashem Amoi. For the English is hard to translate, but for his people are God's portion. So the literal verse and the literal meaning is Chelek. I translated it as portion, which means literally a part of. But actually, the literal meaning of the verse is actually less literal. It's more metaphorical. It means like Chelek, as in portion, as in like an inheritance, like my portion, that which I choose for me. But here, the Alter was taking it even more literal than the literal meaning. Chelek mamash, like a piece, like a part of Hashem. Baruch Hu blessed. As the verse reads. So how do we know that that we can take the verse so literally and say that the verse means literally we're a part of Hashem? Because the verse reads, "Vayipach va'ap of God blew into his nostrils," referring to Adam Arisha, the first man. God blew into his nostrils, Nishmas Chaim, soul of life. And then we have the quote, which the Rebbe says that doesn't know where it comes from in the Zohar, but the Rebbe gives a whole couple of lines here in the citation. But the line is, Man de nafach, one who blows, mitoicha nafach, blows from the inside, etc. And therefore, it's a part of the Hashem himself. I'll have to explain what this means, how blowing means a part of a person himself. But first of all, I want to point out, the Rebbe points this out, that in the first, in part 1 of Tanya, in chapter 2, where the Alter Rebbe also introduces us to the neshama, to the soul, he only mentions the second verse, Vayipach, that God blew. It doesn't mention Kechelek Hashem Amai, that Jews are a part of Hashem from the verse Kechelek, is that we're a part. And the Rebbe says like this, the reason is because here, what the Alter Rebbe, the main objective of the Alter Rebbe here is that even as the neshama is here in this body, even as it's in the body, it's still a part of Hashem. And even though we can't experience it. And that's what we really need to explain here. More than just explaining where the source of the Jew is, that it comes from the essence of Hashem. That's what he's concerned with in chapter 2 of part 1. He wants to tell you what the Nefesh Bahamas is, what the animal soul is, what the godly soul is. So it tells you the nature of them. So it tells you, the soul, the Nefesh, the godly soul comes from the essence of Hashem because Hashem blew it into his nostrils. But over there, he's not concerned with telling you that that's the way it is, even when it comes into your body, because one might leave with the impression that the soul comes from a very high place, but by the time it gets into the body, it's almost too distant from that place. So therefore, he brings this other verse here, which says, Kechelek Hashem Ameh, for his people are part of God, implying that even while they're here, even while the soul has descended from its spiritual lofty place into the body, it still remains a part of Hashem. How does this verse imply it? 2 ways. Firstly, quite literally, the verse there is referring to, as Rashi describes, as the Jews are conquered by other nations. So at least part of the Jews are conquered by other nations. So the verse is talking about Jews as they live in this world to the point that they can even be conquered by other nations, and yet there they remain, Chelek Hashem, they remain part of Hashem. Chelek Hashem Amai. It's firstly, the literal sense. As well, there it says, we refer to Chelek Hashem Amai, and we know the word Amai, which is the Hebrew word for nation, comes from the word Oimois. Right? So this talks about this, that Amiloshin Oimois. Oimois means like coals that are flickering. In other words, it's distant, it's far, it's not inflamed within. So like a full-blown flame that's a spiritual existence, but it's flickering. The spiritual existence is flickering, but yet it's still a fire. So even though it's distant, even though the soul is descended into this body, it still remains Chelik Hashem. And that's what's more important here. We're talking about the effect of sin. And the effect of sin is done by a Jew living in this body. And therefore it's important to know that even while the Jew is in this body, he still remains Chelik Hashem, part of Hashem, at the essence level, as we shall explain. So how do we explain, or what does this mean, that the proof that the soul of man, that the soul comes from Chelik Hashem as part of Hashem, is from the fact that God says, the verse says that God blew a soul of life into his nostrils. And one who blows from the inside. So let's try to understand this. Even though God does not have any form of a body, etc., and the text, I think it comes from the poem of Yigdal. Even though God doesn't have a form of a body nor a body with itself, etc., God forbid. So obviously when the verse says that God blew, it's not literally blowing with literal wind and literal mouth. But God doesn't have a body. And it's not even literal on the metaphorical sense. Because there's no dmus haguf. There's not even the form of a body. Dmus is like the image of a body. Never mind. In other words, God doesn't even have an ethereal body. Like a soul, an angel has an ethereal body that can be described in specific, with the specific descriptions and definitions and boundaries. God doesn't even have a ethereal body at all. So how do you understand that he blew? What does that mean? So he opens up with the famous words, the Torah speaks in the language of man. There are different ways of understanding what this means. Not in Tanya. In Tanya it's quite clear, but this statement that that Torah speaks in the language of man, on one level could just mean that Torah uses human expressions. Just using human expressions, even if it's going to mean that Torah uses extra words. Just because that's the way men speak, that's the way people speak. But then you have, like for example, the Rambam, which uses this idea to explain, for example, he says that all descriptions of Hashem are they're to be taken metaphorically. No, it's not just like a poetic expression that the verse is using because men speak that way, but they're actually meant to be taken metaphorically. So there is some meaning to the original word, even though it's not taken literally. So, for example, I don't know if this is the example he uses, but these are examples that work in English, so it gives you an idea of what we mean. When I tell you that the idea I'm about to share with you is a heavy idea. So what does the word heavy mean? Heavy means you put it on a scale and it weighs heavy. So when I tell you the idea is heavy, it means you could take the idea and drop it onto a scale? Obviously not. But you understand in the context what I mean is, take the metaphorical meaning of heavy. That heavy is something which is difficult to raise. Okay, so this idea is maybe difficult to grapple with. It's a heavy idea. Or, I think actually Rambam does use this example. To raise someone in status. The first part of Moreh Nevuchim is almost entirely like this, where that one goes through a bunch of words and tells you how to extrapolate the metaphorical meaning from the literal word. I think he uses this example to raise somebody up. So raising literally means I pick the person up. But we understand that's not what we mean. We raise him in status. He used to be poor, and now he's a wealthy guy. He used to be whatever, now he's a president of, I don't know. The point is, you're raising the person up in status. So I'm using a literal term to describe a metaphorical thing. But then the Alter Rebbe takes it to even almost a literal, even more literal meaning. That when the Torah uses human expressions, it's not just poetic license to use language, and it's not even just metaphor, but they have to match. So, for example, the Haggadah tells us that when Hashem made the 10 plagues in Egypt, it was etzba Elokim, it was a finger of God. Right? And then when God plagued the Egyptians on the splitting of the sea, it was Yad Hashem, it's the hand of God. Now, is the finger literal and the hand literal? Obviously not. And yet, the Haggadah says, one second, we're switching the metaphor from finger to hand, so there has to be something different that happened. So whatever happened in Egypt is 5 times as big at the splitting of the sea, because it's a hand versus a finger. A finger is 1 and a hand is 5 fingers. So even though it's not literal, but there are certain elements of what the Torah is using to describe that are actually taken literally in their metaphorical interpretation. So however you understand metaphorically what finger and hand mean, so the difference between a finger and a hand literally is the same difference as the metaphors. So they're exactly the same in their relationship between each other, but not in what they are. It's not a hand, not a finger, but the same relationship between a hand and a finger is the same relationship that the two metaphors have. And therefore, whatever the metaphor for hand is 5 times as big as the metaphor for finger. And that's the way the Alter Rebbe takes it here. So he's going to compare blowing, because that's the way the soul was created, to speech. That's the way the Torah describes everything else. So on the one hand, one can say, okay, the Torah is using the poetic license, speech, because speech is a term which explains, and we say this in many places. This has sources to say this, that speech is a way in which I communicate ideas from that are inside of me to the outside. So creation is like God taking an idea that he has in his brain and putting it into the reality. So it's like a form of expression, and therefore I'm using the metaphor of speech. But here, because the Torah uses speech versus blowing for the soul, and speech for literal creation, so whatever the difference between soul and blowing is, that's the way we're going to understand the difference between all of creation and the making of the soul. In the same way, we're making the distinction between finger and hand, and that whatever the difference between them is, that's the same difference in their metaphor. And that's where we're going to go. Just like there's a distinction and difference, so zeroing on the difference. That's what's good. That's where the literality. That's where the comparison is going to be. Gadol, there is a big distinction and difference. But Adam Atachtan, in human's experience down here, human experience. Al derech mashal, by way of example. Beina hevel, there's a big distinction between the breath sheyotzim mepiv b'diburei, that comes out while he is speaking. Lehevel hayotzai deneficha, rather than the breath that comes out while he's blowing. So both blowing and both speech connote that I am exhaling something that I live on. I live on air, and the air comes out of my mouth, both when I blow or when I speak. But there's a big difference. When that breath comes out while I'm speaking, melubish boy, what's invested in that physical breath is koyach, is power of achayis, and life, ma'at miza'er, very little life of mine. And it's a very external level of what I live off, external amount of air that comes out when I speak, which is why, as I'll say, a person can speak for hours and hours and hours and not get tired, but when a person will if he blows, it takes only a couple of seconds, the person's out of breath already. And even moreover, Stanzals points this out, that a person speaks, he can be doing other things. It doesn't take much out of you. It's an external part of what I live off, is the air that I'm putting into speech. Whereas if I'm blowing, it won't take long, and I can't do anything else. I can't concentrate. I can only be blowing, because it's my air. It's the air that's in my lungs, but I'm living that's coming out when I blow. But when the air comes out through the power of blowing, the metoich, which coming from really from the inside, it's invested in that is a more internal and more internal part of what I live off from the living person, etc. So kacha mamish al derech mashal. So too literally by way of example. So it's literally a way of example. So this is kacha mamish is quite literal in terms of the way we're comparing blowing to speech. But it's only al derech mashal. It's only by way of example because it's not actual speech and not actual blowing. But in the way in which, exactly the way in which we compared in their yachas, in their comparison to each other, they're literal. So exactly the way in which we compared speech and blowing is exactly the distinction between God's speech and God's blowing. Even though God's blowing and God's speech has nothing to do with our speech or our blowing. So it's kacha mamish literal, but al derech mashal, by example. This term kacha mamish derech mashal you'll see quite a few times throughout Tanya, and if you use the principle I just laid out, you'll see it matches almost every time. So there are much more of example, Hamavdil Abdullah indicates to make distinctions that are to no end. In other words, there's no end to the distance between my speech and God's speech, and my breath and my breath. But they're exactly the same in terms of how they're compared to each other in their relative states of existence. So likewise, Hefresh Atzum Ma'od, there is a exceedingly intense distinction. Lamaila, above. So here we have the word Lamaila, the distinction is above. The distinction between breath and speech is above. So one might think that, hey, it just contradicts what I said before. I said earlier at the beginning that the verse which says that we are a part of God is telling us that even when the soul is invested in the body, it's a part of Hashem. And here he's saying the distinction is Lamaila, is above. So the Rebbe points out that what's the distinction above is Atzum Ma'od, the intense, exceedingly intense. Because exceedingly intense, as the Rebbe says, implies that you could actually experience that distinction. So the experience and the experience and the obviousness of that distinction between the creation of the soul and everything else is only obvious in a spiritual place where you can sense the soul. But at their essence DNA level, as we'll explain, even down here the soul is exceedingly different, of a different type than the rest of creation. That at least in the way you can see it, it's more clear, it's more obvious. The distinction is more obvious above in the spiritual state, where you can actually see and appreciate the soul. So the distinction between all of the hosts of the heaven, everything that exists, not just hosts of the physical heavens, but even angels. Angels, spiritual beings, whose entire existence is malach, meaning not just angel, but also messenger. That their entire existence is just to serve God, unlike humans who have free choice. So even these lofty spiritual ethereal existences, which were created from something, from nothing into something, which means prior to their existence they were nothing. And now they exist. God put them into being. And they live and they exist only from the external element of God's energy, and the flow, which flows, which is a given or bequeathed. From the infinite God Himself, the infinite energy to give life to all of existence, to all of the worlds, spiritual and physical. And therefore it's only external. Like speech, in which in speech the breath that's there is external. And this element of external life that God invests in all of creation, including the most spiritual of them, is Nikras, is referred to in the verse, is described by way of example as the breath of His lips. But the breath of the lips, as it's the breath of the mouth that's invested in speech, not the breath of the mouth that's invested in blowing. Yeah, it would be confusing that is. Alter Rebbe, by way of example, like it says, that from the breath of His mouth comes all of existence. V'hu, and this breath of the mouth, is the life, which is invested in words. That's in the 10 utterances through which God created the world. I'm just going to finish the parenthesis and I'll explain. Which are these words are vessels and ways in which things draw down. That's explained in chapter 11 of part 2 of Tanya. And the bottom line is, as it's explained there, in other words, speech, right, has two elements. Speech has the actual words, right, and then there's the breath that's invested in those words. So the breath that's in the words, the physical words I'm speaking, the breath that's invested there is like the life that I'm putting into the words that are now going to live outside of me, so to speak. Now the words themselves are the containers that transmit the breath from inside of me to outside of me, right? So in essence, that breath only exists when it's packaged in words. Otherwise, that breath doesn't really exist, or at least doesn't manifest or come out of my mouth. It only comes out through the container through the vessel, as it refers to it here, through the vessel of the words. So when all of existence was created, it comes from two things together. It comes from God has to invest energy, but that energy has to be contained and transmitted through some vehicle, just like the words are the vehicles that bring the breath out of me into the world around me. So what all of existence is created from that package of life that's invested in a container. And therefore it's a very external and low level of divine energy, because divine energy is pure. It's beyond containers that transmit information from one place to another. the essence of divine energy. External levels of divine energy are only invested in transmitters known as words. And that's where angels and all of existence come from. Or let's put it a different way. Prior to the investment of let's say God's breath exists, or that energy exists, or the breath exists inside me, in theory, at least potentially exists before I ever speak. But these angels, do they exist before God utters those words? No. Their entire existence is only created by the fact that there's been words that contain a little bit of energy in it that transmit that information out into their existence. So prior to the utterances of God's saying, let there be an angel, let there be light, let there be all these things, all of those things don't exist. Even in the potential sense, they don't necessarily exist. Because their entire existence is only created by the fact that some miniature amount of energy was invested in words to be uttered by God that created all these things, all metaphorically speaking. The point being that it's only external energy, and only once it's packaged in a vessel, in a receptacle, known as words. Somewhat clear? Yeah. Okay, now let's compare that to the way the soul of man is created. So there's an intense difference between energy, external energy that's invested in a container, in words, in a vessel that transmits information. That's what everything else is created by. And that is exceedingly different than the way the soul of man is created, which to begin with has been drawn down, or at the beginning has been drawn forth from God's internal life, so to speak, which God invests. It says, and he blew. So soul comes from breath. Does breath exist prior to his speech? Of course it does. That's the whole point. The difference between blowing and speaking is that blowing doesn't need words to transmit, to bring out that life. When I speak, the life and the breath that's invested in the speech needs the words in order for it to be manifest. And therefore, the creation of everything that exists is essentially only from the breath once it's invested in words. Whereas the soul of man comes from being blown, which means it exists. In other words, it's an expression of divine energy prior to being packaged in some container or vessel. It's God blowing. That doesn't need a container or vessel. It just blows. And that's where the soul of man comes from. Even though later it also ends up going into a container of words. That's why it says the word tchila. It has to go into a container of words. Otherwise, how does it end up in a body? And that's let us make man. And afterwards, after it's been blown, after it emerges from the essence of God's energy as expressed in the metaphor of blowing, which doesn't need words to exist, it's just the life that was inside my lungs is now outside of me. So the divine energy that God, so to speak, has of itself is now expressed and manifest in something called the soul before it reaches any container, known as a word or a keli or whatever other metaphor we use here. But once it's been emerged as blown, once it's emerged from God's essence, now it exists. But that's way too ethereal to exist anywhere in any world, even though the soul is still there. Yarda, so this essential soul comes down, B'Seiser Madrega, through the secrets of levels. I think this is a paraphrasing from a verse, if I'm not mistaken. Gamkein as well, through words. Which words? Sheva Maimer, and the utterance described in the verse, Nasa Adam, let us make man, chulu, etc. So even man, at the end, is in words. But that's only after the soul emerged as a pure breath of Hashem. But in order for it to fit into a body, it's got to go through the words.
Adam about the goof, or
sorry?
Nisa Adam about the goof, or about the neshama?
Nisa Adam is about the way in which the neshama can be packaged to fit into a body. It goes through many levels. First of all, the soul itself, okay, when it emerges from God, it's just a pure divine piece of energy. It has to develop a conscience, a godly conscience, and then it has to develop a human conscience, nefesh bahamis, and then only there it's got to be invested into man.
But Nisa Adam is before Vayipach, right? Hashem says Nisa Adam, and then...
In terms of the order?
Yeah. And he makes that goylem, and then...
So maybe God makes the packaging and then invests of his blowing into it. I don't know the technical order, maybe. But as he says, what's the point of Nisa Adam? So that this essential soul can be packaged and put into the body. Mm-hmm. And that's why I usually said before that if you're talking about breath that's invested in speech, that breath only emerges with speech. And therefore, everything else that exists, even though it has God's breath in it to exist, but it's only God's breath once and as it is expressed in speech. And therefore, they reach no higher than God's speech, all of existence. Whereas man, even though he also is created by speech, because otherwise how does he live in a body? But it does exist prior to speech also. In the same way blowing exists prior and independent of speech. So it's God's blowing, and then that essential life that emerges after being blown has to now be invested in words that it can fit into a body. But it doesn't take away from the essence fact that even as that life force is invested in the word that are invested in the body, it still, at its DNA level, remains God's essential breath. It's only a question of packaging. And therefore, the soul as it's in this body, even though in its very essence and it's on its DNA level. I'm using the word DNA because that's the metaphor in chapter 2 of part 1 of Tanya, where every single part of the body, even though it all one emerges as a toenail and one emerges as a brain, at the DNA level, they're both still the same equal child of the parent. Right? So the DNA level of the neshama is God's breath. God blew it. And then its packaging is through the words, let us make man, which helps it invest in the body, etc. And therefore, it's possible, and this is the reality, that a Jew can walk around in which his entire conscious experience comes from God's words, Nasa Adam, let's make man, and those words are lower than the words that were used to create an angel, and therefore, consciously speaking, the human being down here is less conscious of his godly soul than the angel, which is fully conscious of its godly life, but yet the consciousness of the angel, of its godly life, is capped at the level of divine speech. Whereas the godly truth of the soul that the person is not conscious of goes way back to the very essence of God's breath. So it's a DNA thing, but it isn't necessarily a conscious thing. And that's expressed in the way the Rebbe explains it based on his father's interpretation in the next couple of lines of these verses.
Is that why the Yipach and Nice Adam are separate? Nice Adam creates a nefesh, so to speak, and the Yipach puts in the Shama into it?
In a way. Exactly what Nice Adam does, I'm not sure.
Yeah. But it's the same, it's speech, just like creating
that's right.
The malachim or an animal or
that's
a
right.
table, right?
They're two separate things.
Yeah.
So Nice Adam creates the human package.
Yeah.
And then, or I'm not sure which one comes first, but then there's an essential DNA of divine energy expressed in the metaphor of blowing that's invested in that package. And if no matter how far down the package goes, at the DNA, at the essence level, it's still God's essential breath. Whereas when it comes to speech, it's only breath that's invested in speech. There's no higher. So prior to speech, there is no existence of angels. Prior to the speech of let's make man, sure there's a soul. There's God's breath. There's still a soul. So it exists even prior, so to speak, not literally prior, but metaphorically prior to God's speech. Whereas angels don't exist unless God speaks. Because that energy only emerges with speech. It's an external level of energy, of breath. Okay. Therefore, he says, Nikra Malachim, therefore angels are referred to in the verse in various different times. B'Shem Elakim, with the name Elakim. They're referred to as gods. But gods, they use the divine name of Elakim. Because of in verses. It brings 3 different verses, and Rebbe's father explains why 3 verses, and Rebbe explains on the Rebbe's father's teaching and how, and a lot of what I just explained emerges from that sikha, or from that talk. It says, for God your Lord is the God of gods, and gods of gods. He's the Elakim of angels. Because the angels themselves are referred to as gods, at least in the term of Elakim, this name of God. And not Yud Kei Vav Kei, not the tetragrammaton, which we use Kechelek Hashem Amai for his people are a portion of God. The name we use of Hashem there is Havaya, Yud Kei Vav Kei. Whereas when it comes to angels, we use Elakim. And it gives in the second verse, praise this to the God of gods, and the sons of God became to stand, and this all refers to angels. So why they refer to as Elakim? Why they refer to as that name of God? Because their drip, literally unique means they siphon or they receive energy. Is only from the external level of divine energy, as we just explained in the metaphor of speech versus breath. Which is only the amount of energy that's invested in just words, which, as explained in part 2 of Tanya, is Shem Elakim, B'Shem Elokim, and the name of Elokim, who P'chinas Chitzonius, is external l'gab B'Shem Havaya and compared to the name of God. But the soul of man, which comes from the very internal and essence life, so to speak, of the divine, like the breath itself, Hashem Baruch Hu, is, as the verse says, it's a part of Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, not the name of Elokim. So what? Excuse me, I'll finish the line and I'll explain. Kishem Havaya, because the name of Yud Kei Vav Kei, the name of God Himself, not Elokim, which is what angels are referred to. So the name of Hashem, Moira, implies al pnimis hachayis, into the internal life, as explained, just the breath itself, independent of speech. Shilamayla malam pnimis oisis, which is way above speaking, and as we explained, which is why a person gets much more tired when they blow, because they're giving of what they live off and expressing that. So the divine DNA, so to speak, is invested in the godly soul itself, as opposed to angels, which only reach Elokim, which is an external expression, external compared to the name of Yud Kei Vav Kei. So that points out, and this is where a lot of this stuff emerges, and you'll understand it in a minute, is these verses tell us that the angels are called Elokim. Do we ever find anywhere that Jews are called Yud Kei Vav Kei? Nowhere. No one's. When Mashiach comes, it says that that tzaddikim will be referred to by God's name, but we're not called Elokim. So actually, this almost makes it sound like angels are higher, because they're actually called Elokim. So through his father's explanation, he says that's exactly the point. Angels, because they're conscious of their source, are called by their source. They are fully conscious of their divine energy, and therefore they're called by their divine energy. And what would that be? Only Elokim. Whereas a Jew, not conscious of his godly source, and therefore could never be called by his source, but what is he a part of? Yud Kei Vav Kei. And therefore what these verses imply, by the very fact that angels are called Elokim, what we're telling you is that the question here is not an issue of conscience. The question here is not an issue of what you're aware of, but what's essentially there.
What we see by Rabbi?
Oh, so there's an example. He's the exception that proves the rule. He's someone who is fully aware of his source, and therefore he could say he's just an expression of the divine truth. It's the exception that proves the rule. Whereas the point here being that even the Jew, when he's down here in this world, he's not being called by God's name. He's in a body, he's not conscious of his soul, he's living a life that looks like anybody else, and as far as what he's conscious of is, maybe he's conscious of the fact that God said, let us make man. But it doesn't take away from the fact that he's still part of God, because at the essence DNA level, his DNA is divine DNA. Whereas the angel is called by his source. He's called Elokim, but that's it. He's called Elokim and no higher, because he's fully conscious of his source, and therefore he's referred to the name of his source. But his source is Elokim, is an external expression of divine energy. So this is kind of parallel to, if you're looking at part 1 of Tanya, this is parallel to chapter 2 of part 1, where it describes the DNA of the neshama. If you remember from there, part 1 in chapter 3 and then 4, he gets to the development of the soul's consciousness, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and then action, and that comes in the next part of chapter 4 here in Igeres HaTeshuva.